Good evening. This evening I would like to take each one of you on an adventure. I think it's been said many times that there is a design. And yet, do we really believe that in actual fact? There is a design, and it relates to not only the universe, but right down to the smallest, tiniest thing. And there is a particular pattern that connects the universe and the tiniest thing, and that is the spiral. And I would like to share something of that with you this evening. There is a key word which relates to this spiral, and it is the word motion. All things are in motion, whether you believe it or not. All things. Even though I might be standing still, say, relative to this floor or this building, it makes no difference. We are still moving at a tremendous rate through space. So in actual fact, things are moving and you can never, ever go back. I'd like to illustrate something here in relationship to our solar system. And if we use a line to represent the path of our sun through space. Now I'd like to indicate to you that this line is not a straight line. So right at the outset we need to establish that there is no such thing as a straight line in nature. There are only curves. If you hear someone talking about straight lines, it'll probably be in a math classroom somewhere. So everything moves in a particular curve, which is just simply a segment of something larger. But here's our sun moving through space. It moves through space at the rate of 630,000 miles per hour. Now, this figure is relative. It depends on who you read. But for our purposes this evening, let's look at this as being the speed of our sun through space. And if you stop and consider that, in 1 month, we will travel through space over 423 million miles. That's moving very rapidly. Now, our sun has its sun. It has its point of orientation. So our sun is traveling about some central point through space, and that point has a point of orientation. And you could go on. Now, if you consider just the Earth itself, and this is the Earth down here, moving about our sun through space. It is traveling relative to our sun, with the sun being its point of orientation, at the rate of about 67,000 miles per hour. So our sun, our Earth, is moving about our sun at a particular rate, but it is also keeping up with the sun. Therefore, our Earth is traveling at a tremendous rate. And you can see that if you go out and look at some of the outer planets, you would see that they're also moving quite rapidly, and they're also keeping up with the sun. Therefore, we're really moving. Really. I mean, now there's something else that's involved here which I'd like for you to sense. And there is a pattern of something that keeps moving around us. Right now it's about full, and it's called our moon. Do you ever sense that the moon is working harder than the earth? Have you ever heard it complain? And there it is. Our moon is moving about us as we are moving about the sun, and our sun is moving about something else. And you can see that in relationship to the moon, there is a design which indicates that possibly it is having to work a little faster. It is having to do a little bit more than our Earth, and our Earth is having to do a little bit more than our sun in relationship to this whole design. So there's a real fascinating pattern in relationship to all this, and yet it is moving through space at this tremendous rate. It's a rate at which you really can't relate to. Now, how fast have you traveled in the sense of, say, an airplane? Maybe 500-600 miles an hour? In your automobile, now it's 55, something of this nature. You really don't have any idea what that is, because when you look outside and you look at the sun or you look at the moon or even distant planets, you do not have a sensation of movement. Isn't that right? And yet you're moving at this tremendous rate. So there's a stillness involved. There's a stillness in relationship to the movement that is actually taking place. So here is something in relationship to this pattern of design that I find very fascinating and exciting, because it reveals something in relationship to the pattern of nature. And you can expand this up to include the galaxy, or you can bring it right down to the smallest atom. So here is a particular pattern. Now, this particular design that relates to our solar system reveals an invisible realm of which we really can't relate to, so we're relating to the visible aspect of it. There is control involved, and we need to see this. Otherwise, the Earth would probably take off one Sunday afternoon about 4 o'clock and just do its thing. Or maybe the moon would just take off at the same time and I'll see you. But actually, it is very precise in terms of the control. For instance, the moon always keeps its same face, facing the Earth. Therefore, it's rotating on its axis at the same rate that it moves around the Earth. So there's something revealed here in terms of control. So there is a design to our solar system, and there are built-in controls in relationship to this. Now, one way we can see this in terms of control is the idea of one rolling up their hair, for instance. The ladies I'd have to pick on here. Have you ever rolled up your hair? Have you ever wondered why you roll up your hair? Probably not. But the reason you do it is because you have a design, or maybe you call it a hairdo, in mind. So you get out the rollers and you roll it up. And this is a pattern of the spiral, isn't it? So you have this design in mind. You either want the hair rolled up this way, or you want it tucked in, or you want it big curls, or you want little tiny ones or something. And so you have this particular hairdo in mind. And as a result of this, you proceed with the rollers. Maybe you sleep on them all night and you're miserable for a while, but nevertheless, you end up with this particular hairdo. So there's a reason for that. Now it's just kind of with the little roller, it goes type thing and sprays and everything. It's real neat. Modern conveniences are. But actually, even though you have a design in mind, you have to do something in order to provide the control. to have a realization of that design. So there is control and there is design to all of this. And yet there is power. Have you ever wondered how much power there is in relationship to the Earth moving through space? I mean, there doesn't appear in that particular realm to be an energy shortage. We don't stop and refuel. Have you ever noticed? We are moving through space at this tremendous rate, and yet we are not polluting space as we move through space. We are simply moving, and there is a particular power involved here. And this leads to the idea of strength. Strength is associated with this. If you take a string, for instance, and man does that, and you look at the particular string, well, you twist it, you spiral it, which gives it strength. If you unwind this, you would find that there would not be as much strength, right? So we have a design, we have control, we have power or strength, all built in as part of this particular pattern. And all things are in motion. Now, I would like to say something particularly about four kingdoms, which we are all familiar with. There is the kingdom of man, and there is the kingdom of the animals, and the plants, and the mineral kingdom. Now, I particularly like to put things in four kingdoms. However, for the most part, man in general thinks of himself as being part of the animal kingdom. This is not so. He is different. He provides an apex in regard to creation. However, there is something that we can see from the standpoint of the spiral that connects all of these four kingdoms. And I would like to consider that with you this evening. For instance, if we were to look at the mineral kingdom, for instance, we don't generally think of the mineral kingdom as being alive. Now that's right, isn't it? Generally speaking, we don't really think of the mineral kingdom as being alive. And even if it were, it probably wouldn't be well. But nevertheless, we don't usually think of that. Now, I have a rock, which is one of my pet rocks. I brought two of them this evening for a reason. And on one side of this particular rock, someone has written these words, "Please turn me over." On the other side, it says, that felt good. Indicating that possibly the rock has feeling. I think that's exciting. Now, just for a thought, would you go along with the idea that the sun is part of the mineral kingdom? The earth is part of the mineral kingdom. The moon is part of the mineral kingdom. The other planets are part of the mineral kingdom. Yes? They are moving through space very orderly. There is order. There is precision. You can count on the sun being at a particular place at a particular time during the year. You can depend on it. How dependable are you? This is orderly. How orderly is your closet? In other words, something that is not alive is more orderly than you? No. Okay. I just thought I would lead you into that. There's another aspect of this. We consider that man is able to reproduce himself. We see this. This is obvious. We all have parents. We also recognize that this is true in relationship to the animals and the plants. But for some reason or other, we draw a line between the plant and mineral kingdom, or between man, animal, and the plant kingdom and that of the mineral. Indicating that the mineral kingdom, for some reason or other, does not behave in quite the same way. And yet I would indicate to you that the pattern of the spiral is present in all these kingdoms. Therefore, the pattern of the spiral is the thread that moves through and connects all kingdoms. And so we can illustrate this in different ways. But in order to do that, I would like to add a mathematical progression up here. Start off with these numbers. We take 0 and 1, we add those two, it adds to 1. We take 1 and 1, that adds to 2. And we can go on. By now you should be able to tell me what the next number is. And you could go on around the board, or around the room in fact, forever. The numbers would get larger as you go. You can see here that at the beginning the numbers are quite close together. And as you move out, they are not quite so close together. Now, these numbers represent cycles that we find in nature. Cycles that are present, and it also represents certain patterns that are found in music and art, your physical body, the plants, the animals, the rocks, the whole works. But we maybe can see something here in relationship to this, that these numbers represent the beginning of a cycle. Now there are other numbers, obviously, that aren't up here. And even after I put these numbers, it will not completely fill it in. But I would like to put the number 7 and put a circle around it to separate it. And the number 12 and number 20, 33, 54, and 88. These numbers then would represent, in this particular pattern, this particular mathematical progression, the end of a particular cycle. For instance, this is 89 is the beginning of a cycle, 88 is the end of a cycle. For instance, how many black and white keys are there on the piano? There are 88. Now, we had to chop that off someplace. In other words, we maybe could have gone on to another cycle here. But 88 is the end of a particular cycle. 54. How many cards are there in a deck of cards when you go and buy a deck? There are 54. There are 52 regular cards, which are split up into 13 and 4, and plus 2 jokers. Right? Okay, so you can begin to see something here. Now, if you were to, if you can play the piano and you could sit down to it, you would actually be able to play an infinite variety of music. Go on and on. The same thing is true in relationship to a deck of cards. How many different possibilities are there in a deck of cards? Tremendous number, to say the least. So you can see the vastness of the design that we're referring to here. Tremendous scope involved here in this whole perspective. Now, if we look at man for a minute, we might begin to see that there are certain patterns of growth and development. For instance, at 13, we call this puberty. At 21, we are physically mature. Now, these are just standard numbers that everybody knows and talks about, and is something that is obvious, but not necessarily seen by all in relationship to a mathematical progression. All right. There's another particular break in time which I would like to mention at this, and we'll come back to, and that is this period of 8 years of age, when the eyes, for instance, are fully developed now and ready for the child to begin to use his eyes or her eyes as they should be used. In other words, prior to this, we probably try to teach our children to do things with their eyes that we shouldn't. And as I said, I'll come back to that. But there are certain breaks in relationship to all of this. So you can see something of this pattern in relationship to man. You can also see something of this pattern in relationship to music. In an octave, how many actual notes are there? Well, there are 7. But there are 8 total keys. The 8th one is the beginning of the next octave. Nature never leaves you hanging. You ever notice that? There's always something that's going to take over. Another cycle is going to open up as another one, as one closes. So you can begin to see this particular pattern. There's a total of 13 keys in an octave of both white and black keys. There are 8 white ones, there are 5 black ones, and the black ones are in groups of 3s and 2s. Okay? So you can begin to see this particular pattern. So we have a little insight maybe into the fact that music is related to this. And we can see the total number of keys then. There's another number which I'd like to call phi. That is equal to 1.618. And there is another number which I call phi prime, which is 0.618. If you take 0.618 times 34, you will end up with 21. Now, you have to round that off because, after all, these are irrational numbers. And these are not. So if you take 0.618 times 34 and round it off, you get 21. Or if you take 1.618 times 34, round it off, you get 55. So you can see the particular connection here that relates to this particular pattern. This is a mathematical progression that is the design of nature in relationship to all of these 4 kingdoms. And these are the numbers that relate all of that. Now, if you take and consider your physical body, this is fun to do, by the way. And I like to say at this point, if you take my word for what I'm saying this evening, you will come up short. You need to go out and do this yourself. Then you'll have the experience of discovery. And that's important. But it's fun for me to share this and begin to open up something for you, because I guarantee you there are many things here that you've never thought of. And one of them is that if you take your total height, whatever that is, and multiply your height times 0.618, you will find where your navel is supposed to be. If it isn't there, you're probably not completely in the design somehow. But anyway. Now, we can also see that if we were to consider your finger, for instance. Have you ever taken the time just to ponder what is before you? For instance, your fingerprints spiral. You ever noticed? Your hair, you're not curly-headed, you're spiral-headed, things like that. And the crown up here. There's a certain design and pattern to these things. Well, if you take your finger, and it isn't really the thing to do to start out in a crowd doing this, because, but if you have nothing to do on Sunday afternoon at 4 o'clock, well, measure from the end of your finger to the first joint. Okay? Not now, but later. And then you'll see that if you multiply that times 1.618, you'll get this next little segment. And this times 1.618 will give you that little segment. And then you can see that this is that, and then if you go from here, that isn't the distance up to your elbow, because if you have to take the total distance. But in actual fact, if you look at this and you take the first segment from the end of your finger to the first joint, there are 21 of these units from here up to your shoulder. So there are 21 of these units. Another thing that we can do is to look at your face. Now, you're always looking in the mirror. The next time you do, be fascinated with something other than the usual things. And consider a point that is right here in between your eyes and the level of your eye. And if you will consider then the distance from that point to the top of your head, and you take 0.618 of that and measure from this point in your nose to your hairline, assuming you aren't in that stage where you're losing your hair, you will find exactly the proper distance. If you go from that same point to the chin, if you have one that's defined, and take 0.618 of that distance, you will find the tip of your nose. And if you take the difference of that distance between the tip of your nose and your chin, you'll find your mouth. And you can do the same thing this way, from the middle of your head to the side of your head. If you take 0.618 of that distance, you'll find the middle of your eye. And if you take the distance between that point and the middle of your eye, multiply that times 0.618, you'll find the corner of your eye. You are very precisely made, fearfully and wonderfully made. It is all put together on the basis of this number, whether we're talking about your arm or whether we're talking about the full length of your body. So this is something to look at. Don't take my word, just have fun checking this out somehow. Now, we can see then that the human body is built on the basis of these numbers. And by the way, you didn't figure that out with your mind at the time that it was being constructed. I think that's interesting. Now, I would like to use an example in relationship to art here, and indicating that there is a particular pattern which shows up in what we call the golden rectangle. And this is called the golden mean. Now, if we take a line and I'm going to choose to make this line a particular length, in this case 21 inches. And if I take the length of this line times 0.618, I'll get 13. So if I mark this off, from here to here is 13 units. So we have then, the overall length then is 21 inches, and this distance in here is 13. And obviously this would be then what? 8 inches. So we can put that out here. Now, if we take that same distance and we draw ourselves a rectangle, we now have what is called a golden rectangle. You ever noticed how things that are square are not too comfortable? That it's more pleasing to the eye to look at something such as this, for instance, the blackboard. Or if you've ever thought about it, considered a credit card. This is a precise golden rectangle. No wonder they're so easy to use. So we have then a golden rectangle, which means that if I take this distance here times 0.618, I end up with 13, which is this distance here. And we could put another line in, which is a square. So there is a square contained within this golden rectangle. We could do the same thing back this way. And we have a square over here, and these two squares then overlap. We could also do this. We could take this distance here and split it up and draw in two additional lines. And we have 4 points of dynamic symmetry in the middle of this, which the artist talks about. Now, we can also see that here is, this particular area here is a golden rectangle, and this is a golden rectangle, and so on. In other words, we have golden rectangles within golden rectangles in relationship to this particular pattern. Now, we've indicated to you that there are certain things in relationship to the mineral kingdom that have a relatedness to all this, and I'd like to at this time indicate that. I don't know if you've ever noticed it, but if you go around picking up rocks or looking at them, you can invariably find them in this particular shape. And it's an unusual shape. I call it a diamond shape. But if you considered a point here and you draw in a line like this, point here, which is halfway in between, you'll notice that you put this up there, it has the same shape. Which means that if you come in from that corner over to this one, and you have a line, I can find this particular point here is 0.618 of the total distance. So if I draw on here a line across this particular, measure the total distance and multiply that times 0.618, I will end up where that peak is in there. That's how precise all the rocks in the mountains break. I think that's interesting. It's just one of the things, the pattern. Now, basically, that is a spiral, as you can see. Well, let me erase this for a minute. I would like to use the same diagram. And I think you can see that this particular pattern relates the rocks and relates to man and the animals. I'd like to draw this line back, and I'd like to draw a line over this way and say to you that if I take this length and multiply it by 0.618 and measure in from here, I'll get that point. And if I draw a line like so, I take the length of that line, multiply it times 0.618, measure in, I get that point. So, I get this point. Now if I take this segment of line or this segment and multiply them times that, I can find that point. In other words, any line that I draw up here now will fit in the pattern, assuming the diagram is drawn accurately. Well, if I draw a line up here, it's the same thing. I'm across this way, down this way, so on and so on. Then if I use this corner, because you can see that this is a square, and we can draw in then an arc. Now you notice that I used a series of straight lines, and I said over here that there are no such things as straight lines. Well, man has to use straight lines in order to illustrate the curves. But here are the curves. And if we draw in another one, we see this one. Now this is not exactly a square, but you can begin to see then that there's a particular pattern. Okay? Now, a while ago I mentioned that there are 21 units up your arm in relationship to this length here. If I were to stretch out my arm like so, and begin to curl it in. Do you see the implications here? The relationship to this particular pattern, there it is. There's the spiral pattern, all related to 21 units. I have here a chambered nautilus, and there's the precise design of this particular creature. It's interesting that in looking at this, you can see daily growth lines. And if you look at all the chambers that are in here, these are monthly chambers. In other words, each month we have a new chamber. You can count the number of chambers and see how old this particular creature was at the time that it got into this fix. So here's a particular pattern. There's another thing that I like to do at this particular point. So you can see the fish. See the pattern of the fish in relationship to this particular design. So these things are all present and with regard to this particular pattern of things. So we can see that the artist used this. The music is based upon this. Your physical body is based upon this. The animal kingdom, here's another particular example of that. It's an interesting shape, this particular gastropod. And I have a globe over here, and I'd like to use it for a minute. Notice that the various continents have different shapes. And if you take this particular one in South America, interesting, huh? Not only that, if you measure this angle here and this angle here, you will find it is the same. If you measure this angle here along with this angle, you'll find that to be the same. It even has a little curl on the end, and the mountains are down the side where the spiral is. Interesting. Same thing is true in relationship to India. On a bigger map, you could see it a little bit better. But here is a particular animal that has the shape of continents. Fascinating, huh? Here's another type of example where you see the definite spiral. Also, the mineral kingdom. Here's a piece of lava. It was flowing. It spirals. We also have part of a plant. You notice that this looks like a meandering stream. So water also flows, and this is why it moves around the countryside the way it does. And yet here's part of a plant, probably the root system, where it actually split up and then started twisting around the two parts that bifurcated. So it's interesting, providing more strength as it gets further out from the tree. So here's something that relates to a design that is quite exciting when you begin to see that all kingdoms are involved. And yet there's a particular expression here. All of these things that I've mentioned are expressing something, even down to the fact that if you take two rabbits, male and female, one of each, put them in a room or a large room, and you feed them and look after them for a year, at the end of 1 year you'll have precisely 233 pairs of rabbits. In other words, this is the pattern. It's the same thing true with reference to the beehive. It really doesn't matter. All things in nature do this. This pattern is present everywhere. And these are but just a few examples. All things move in this particular pattern, and they grow and develop in this particular pattern. Well, if that's the case, then we might be able to consider something in relationship to the expression of people. And I would like to spend a little time with this, particularly as it relates to to children. I have with me a piece of art that was put together, you might say, by a 4-year-old girl, and it has an interesting pattern to it. Now, if we look at this particular structure up here, which she called a house, and now, if you give a 4-year-old child a piece of blank paper and ask them to draw something, you might even suggest that they draw a house, you will find that they will come up with something that even if you don't know exactly what it is, they know, and they will tell you if you ask them. But if you begin to look at this and analyze it, you will see that they have a certain pattern to this expression here. If you take the distance from here down to here and multiply it times 0.618, you will get the distance from here up to here. And in this particular diagram, if you draw a line through here and you take the distance of that line and multiply it by 0.618, you'll get the bottom of that window. If you take the distance along the roof line and multiply it times 0.618, you'll get the position of the chimney. Now, most children, when they are doing something, by the way, most children kind of do this when they draw. And parents usually say something to them, well, why don't you draw in straight lines? But you see what they've done? They're, in their sketching, they're moving through the patterns in relationship at least to our solar system here, and probably the universe. So there's a particular pattern in their expression. Now, if you see a child that is doing this, you better rush them to the doctor because probably they're having problems, emotional problems. This is the natural thing, if you stop and think about it. If you measure to the top of the door, you will find that if you multiply it times 0.618, you'll get the width of the door. And not only that, if you measure from the top down, taking this line again times 0.618, you'll get the position of the doorknob. If you don't know where a doorknob should be, always ask a child. They'll tell you precisely where it belongs because it is comfortable at that point, never in the middle or whatever of the door, right in here or up here somewhere. In other words, here's a particular design that is being revealed by the child in the child's expression. Now, if you look at this, which is a tree, and you take the overall length of that and multiply it times 0.618, you'll get the place where she, in this particular one, stopped the trunk of the tree and started the branches. There are 7 steps, for instance. This distance here on this particular diagram, take the overall length of that times 0.618 and you'll get the width of it. This seems like a mess when you look at it. Now they have some idea as to what it's all about, but if you take the total length of that and multiply it by 0.618, you'll get the width of this down here. Not only that, and take the same distance here, you'll find where she really stopped this particular group of lines and meshed it into this group of lines, and they overlap. So there's a certain precision here. There's an absolute precision with regard to this particular drawing. Now, if you stop and think about it, what do parents usually do? They buy a coloring book, particular one maybe Yogi Bear or something of this nature, And they ask the child to go over in the corner. Mommy usually does this because she's around most of the time. And get out from under my feet and go color. And so the child does this. And they do not stay within the lines at the age of 4. They're not designed to at that age. They may want to color the bear purple instead of black or brown. And so the child brings this, is very proud of it, to Mommy, and Mommy looks at it and says, gosh, you didn't stay within the lines. And you know good and well that a bear is not purple. But the child may have felt purple in that particular moment in relationship to what they were doing and what they were expressing. So we have this particular pattern, which I call the coloring book syndrome, which builds in certain frustrations in children because we have not been able to somehow discern what is really taking place in relationship to the child's development. And I would like to indicate to you with regard to this that this particular pattern also holds true in this design of things. And we might see that there is a pattern which I've actually already indicated to you in relationship to 20, which is the end of a cycle, 21 being the beginning of the next. And this particular pattern here, which is 12 and 13, which I've indicated to you is puberty. And also this particular age in here, ending with 7, beginning with 8. So there are different stages. Now this particular stage from 0, birth we might say, and actually there's something that goes on before birth too, which actually we don't give much consideration to with regard to a particular expression. Now keep in mind we're talking about the expression that is revealed here in this particular rock, or whether we're talking about this particular shell, or we're talking about the solar system. We're talking about an expression, or this particular body. It's an expression, and through that body comes an expression. That all fits into this particular design of things. And that's revealed through this. The numbers are close together, which indicates that maybe we need to be patient. Because when things start moving on a little faster, things are, you need to be under control. All right, the same thing is true with the child. At the point of birth, and in fact, we could say that from the standpoint of parents, that for the most part, they do not have a clue as to what childbirth is all about and what is involved in raising children. For the most part, we stumble through it. It's sort of an accidental happening. Now, there are certain things that we could begin to look at in regard to this. First of all, in this first step, we have a period which relates to a very physical experience as far as the child is concerned. Very physical experience. This is a particular period where they love to imitate. Right there, that puts the responsibility onto the parents, because who is available to imitate? So we have this imitation period. It's a very physical experience. They're going through many different things. Now, there's another aspect here that relates to discipline. This is the particular period in the child's development when discipline should be established. If it is not established, it is very difficult to go back and establish it. For instance, if a child moves through particular development up through 21, and they have missed something that they should have gotten at the age of 5, you may be able to go back and fill in the void somewhat, but you will never complete it because you miss it at that point. If I missed supper this evening, then that's it. I can't go back and have that supper. I may go later and eat something which may take the place of it, but it will not have been the same thing. And that's the point. So we have this particular pattern. It relates to this physical development in the early age. And if something is missed, you can't go back and do it. Yet they have what are called crawling rooms at the first grade, where a child is having trouble in relationship to entering the first grade, may go back and crawl, because for the most part, parents don't recognize that their children are going to learn to walk all on their own. How about that? At the age of 1, approximately. You don't have to show them, you don't have to encourage them or help them. They will do it automatically when they are through with the crawling stage. And then there are no built-in frustrations. And that's where they get started. All based upon a particular design. Here. Discipline, learning to obey. Learning to respect. This is a particular pattern that should be developed here. There are certain instinctive qualities that a child has in this particular age bracket. For instance, at about the age of 2 to 3, a child will begin to dance, male or female, automatically. Have you ever noticed that? They'll begin to dance. A lot of parents will say, well, don't do that silly thing. I mean, that looks silly. But this is an urge that they have in relationship to that particular thing that is happening with them. Just like they would want to come over here and draw out this particular pattern, so would they want to dance, which relates to a certain expression, certain thing that's happening with them at that time. If we don't allow them to, then certain frustrations are built in there too. So we have music then should be provided for them. One should select their music. Something that has to do with rhythms, not the usual beats and rhythms that you see today, but nevertheless certain rhythms that are there. In other words, they should learn a pattern of rhythm, which will help them learn to read later on, because doesn't that involve rhythm? They'll also have some sensing of sound, which will help them learn to spell. Various other things that we could go into here. Toys. Christmas time. Lots of toys. Make-believe. Well, if you provide them with toys, you need to be very selective in regard to that. Because if you take, for instance, a tea set, and you provide that to the little girl, and now she cannot use her own creative expression to make mud pies or whatever, you have now stolen away from that child the opportunity of developing that creativeness that is present within the child by providing it with a substitute, built-in frustrations. This is something to really look at in relationship to the pattern that we see in terms of the design of nature and the pattern of all these kingdoms that I'm talking about. And yet if you move on up, you begin to see that there's something happens at this particular age. We should never teach our children how to read before the age of 8. Their eyes aren't ready for that, regardless of how smart we think our children are. Because if I'm smart, my kids must be smart, and this type of thing. But there's a certain thing that needs to take place with regard to this. The mind begins to come into play here. Now, a young child in this particular bracket here cannot reason, as we might think. So what we do, we call them off. Now, you don't do that because, I said so. And then you explain it to them. They can't understand. They can't even understand really at this age. But we can still do certain things, put in certain things so that when they develop into the next period, which is the development of the intellect, they can begin to understand that which has already been presented to them, which is essential. So we have a responsibility back here. We should not teach them how to spell, how to do other things like this until they have a very strong foundation with regard to these basic rhythms, basic patterns of discipline, To read and to spell and to all these things require certain discipline, right? Certain things that need to be present. If we have an understanding of those, when they're plugged in at the right time, then something will work out just the way it should in terms of that expression that is already present. So we have then the development of the mind in the between 8 and 13. Memory comes into play. This is important, developing memory. Do you really know what that is? I forgot. Development of feeling, moral character in this particular area. Then from 13 to 20, we have the development of the intellect, and the understanding comes into play. So there is a design to all of this. After all, if it's built into our bodies, it must be built into the expression, which it is, and we can demonstrate that with the diagram. And it's interesting, by the time I get them at the university level, they have all these things that kind of choke up their expression, and they sort of are there, with an expression. It's not too alert or too alive, but it's something to work with, and I've often wondered why. But there is a genius underneath. Each one is born a genius, whether you like it or not. Do you realize how many decisions your mind makes in one day? Deciding to digest your food? Never. All the workings of this, that's genius. Beginning to see what the pattern of that is in relationship to whether it's the solar system or whether it is a particular animal such as this, or a rock, or, by the way, even a pine cone, which has a particular pattern of 13 spirals in one direction and 8 in another. It's all there in all these kingdoms, relating to a particular expression. If we're able to see this as it truly is, we can begin to sense the design because it is present within ourselves. And I think that is an exciting adventure. Thank you.
John, thanks a lot. That was